This program contains discussions of real-life crimes and may not be suitable for all audiences. When Darkness Falls is created for educational and awareness purposes, every effort has been made to ensure accuracy, and we tell these stories with deep respect for the victims, their families, and their communities. The goal is not to sensationalize, but to remember, to understand, and to learn. Christmas is meant to bring families closer together, a day of warmth, faith, and togetherness. But on Christmas Day in 1929, inside a quiet farmhouse, rural North Carolina, the father shattered that promise. By nightfall, family would be gone, and the town would never be the same again. It was Christmas Day 1929 in Germanton, North Carolina, a small farming town tucked into the hills of Stokes County. Germanton was the kind of place where everybody knew each other. The church sat at the center of the community life. The general store was where the neighbors caught up on gossip, traded goods, and extended credit when times in need. And dirt roads that went through tobacco, cotton, and cornfields. And on a quiet December morning, the smell of wood smoke carried across the valley as families gathered for the holiday meals. Life here was simple, not easy. The recession that became the Great Depression began back in summertime. By the time a full crash had hit in October, the ripple effects of the downturn already been felt in communities like rural North Carolina. Crop prices were failing, credit was tightening, and families like the Lawsons had to work even harder than ever to keep food on the table. Still, on Christmas morning, most households found joy in small traditions. The Lawsons, too, had their stockings stuffed and hung and gifts ready. On the surface, they were just another farming family, ready to celebrate the day, peace, togetherness. But beneath the surface, something was stirring. To understand the tragedy, you have to picture what daily life looks like in the town nearly a century ago. Homes were very modest, built by hand, with rough-cut timber, tin roofs, chimney of brick and stone. Electricity hadn't reached every farm yet, so kerosene lamps were lit the rooms after sunset. Water came from wells or springs, hauled in buckets. Winters were cold and drafty, with frost on the windows in the mornings, and the children warming their hands on the wood stove before they had to go walk to school. Sundays were for church, but during the week, life was full work. Children learned early to contribute, hauling firewood, tending to the animals, helping in the fields. The rhyme of the life followed the seasons: planting, tending, harvesting, then winter, repair, and rest. For tobacco farmers, the rhythm was relentless. In spring, seedlings were planted in neat rows. In summer, the fields had been weeded and topped under the relentless Carolina sun. By autumn, leaves were harvested and hung in the curing barns, their sweet, pungent smell filling the air. A good crop meant survival. Bad one meant debt. Tobacco was the king, but it ruled with a heavy hand. Charlie Lawson knew the life well. Born in 1886, he had grown up poor, one of several children in the family of sharecroppers. From boyhood, he knew the weight of a hoe in his hand and an ache of long days in the field. By 1927, after years of scraping and saving, 41-year-old Charlie had managed something many farm boys only dreamed of. He bought his own farm. For him, that meant pride, a mark of success, a step above mere tenant farming. Charlie and his wife Franny had been married since 1911. They built a large family together. In 1929, they had 8 children, though one, a son named William, had died at a very young age in 1920. The 7 who still remained filled their house full of noise and life. Arthur was 19. He was the eldest, strong, dependable, who worked shoulder to shoulder with his father in the fields. Neighbors described him as quiet, responsible, the kind of young man who bore weight of adulthood early. Now there's Marie, was gentle, soft-spoken, often helping her mother in the housework. She was known for her baking. She often looked after her younger siblings. Carrie, 12, and Mabel, 7, were inseparable, bright-eyed girls who attended the local school. They were known to be sweet and polite, often seen walking hand in hand down Brook Cove Road. James, only 4, Raymond, 2, were lively toddlers, full of mischief, chasing each other in the yard and filling the house with laughter. And then there is Mary Lou, the baby of the family, only 5 months old. That Christmas, she was doted on by everyone, the tiny spark of joy in the middle of hard times. To neighbors, the Lawsons seemed like a typical farm family, quiet, hard-working, church-going. There were no whispers of trouble, no outward signs of any storm that was coming. But in the early December, Charlie Lawson did something out of character. He took his family on a trip to Winston-Salem, nearly 15 miles away. For a tobacco farmer, such an outing was very rare, especially so close to Christmas. Money was precious, and families in Germanton rarely spent it on luxuries. But this day, Charlie bought his wife and children brand new clothes, outfitted way far nicer than they would ever wear their daily farm life, and then they let him to take a photo, a formal portrait. This photograph that came from the day of the chilling hindsight. The family sits stiffly, unsmiling, which was customary in that time. Charlie stood tall, Franny beside him, holding baby Mary Lou. Arthur and Marie flanked their parents, the younger children arranged neatly in front. To neighbors, it was an odd indulgence. To later generations, though, it looked like a farewell. Some had wondered if Charlie even knew, even then, what he was planning on doing. Winter mornings were bitter, the air sharp with frost, and earth frozen hard beneath the tobacco barns and bare sycamore. Inside Lawson family, the wood stove had already been stoked, filling the rooms with warmth and the smell of smoke that clung to everything, clothes, curtains, even hair. For the Lawson children, Christmas morning brought simple joy. For those days, stockings weren't stuffed with toys or gadgets. They were stuffed with precious little things like an orange, peppermint stick, maybe a handful of nuts. For rural children, those small treasures were enough to bring a wide-eyed excitement. Fanny, the mother, likely rose before dawn, again preparing breakfast, maybe biscuits, perhaps with molasses or jam, coffee for Charlie, milk for the children. The rhyme of her morning was no different than any other day, and yet it carried the weight of Christmas, a holiday that was both sacred and hard-earned. Arthur, the eldest, was awake early. Hunting was part of the Stokes County, both for food and for sport. That morning, his father had sent him to town for shotgun shells and would be heading into town later. It was a routine errand, ordinary at the time. The other children lingered by the tree, such as it was. For farm families in 1929, a Christmas tree might be cedar or maybe pine from nearby woods, decorated not from store-bought ornaments, but from string to popcorn, paper chains, and maybe a candle or two clipped to the branches. The Lawson children, Carrie and Mabel especially, would have been proud of their homemade decorations. Outside, the frost clung to the barn roofs, and the field lay empty and silent. The sound of Germanton on Christmas morning were muted. No tractors, no wagons, just the occasional crow call and the crunch of boots on frozen ground. Neighbors were gathering in their own homes, preparing meals, giving thanks, and settling into a day of rest. Inside Lawson farmhouse, it seemed like a picture of simplicity. A hard-working farm family celebrating holidays surrounded by one another. No one, not even the neighbors, not the children, not even Fanny herself, could have imagined that before the day was over, this quiet home would be forever marked by horror. By late morning, the Lawson family was moving into their holiday routines. Carrie, just 12, and her little sister Mabel, just 7, they were headed down the Brick Cove Road to their aunt's and uncle's house. In those days, the children walked a long distance to visit family relatives, and for Carrie and Mabel, it was a familiar path, a shortcut through the pass with the family tobacco barn and through the frosted fields. The two girls set off together, their laughter carrying on the cold air. They might have been chatting about the stockings they found that morning, or a holiday meal waiting at their aunt's house. In a small town like Germanton, Christmas meant family, and for the Lawson girls, the short walk was supposed to be part of a happy, ordinary day. Waiting near the barn, Charlie Lawson ambushed his own daughters. The sound of the gunshots split the quiet countryside sharp, echoing through the hills. In a small town where hunters were common, a single shotgun might not have raised any alarm, but this was no hunting trip. Charlie shot Carrie first, then Mabel, which makes certain he ended their lives with a blunt force of the shotgun stock. The barn stood as silent witness. No one saw it happen. No one heard the girls' cries. By the time Charlie dragged their bodies into the barn and concealed them behind the bales of tobacco, the winter fields were still again as if nothing had happened. Back at the house, Fanny was still on the porch, tending to her chores. She could not have known what had just taken place just a few hundred yards away. For her, Christmas morning carried on like any other, sweeping, gathering wood, maybe humming a hymn or two under her breath. Charlie walked back up to the farmhouse, with the weight of what he had just done already heavy on his shoulders. He raised his gun again. Fanny shot dead on the porch, collapsed just feet from the front door. The sound of the blast tore through the quiet air. Inside, Marie must have screamed as she realized what had happened. The younger brothers, James and Raymond, must have scrambled in panic. In a moment, their home, a place they should have been filled with warmth and safety, became a house of horror. Marie had been in the kitchen preparing Christmas baking. Neighbors remembered later she was planning on making a cake for the night's dinner. Something sweet, something special, the kind of small joy that made the hard year even feel lighter. She turned as the sound of the gunshot outside. Her heart surely stopped when she saw her mother fall. Before she could even react, Charlie was inside, the familiar sight of her father, a man who had taught her hard work, how to work on the fields, who had carried her when she was a child, suddenly transformed into something unrecognizable. He raised the gun again. James, only 4, Raymond, just 2, were next. Tiny boys with years of life ahead of them. They had no chance to understand what was happening. The sound of their cries carried through the house, then fell silent, leaving only a hiss of the stove and the creak of the old wood floors. In the bedroom, baby Mary Lou, just 4 months old, lay in her crib. She would never know the world beyond her family's farmhouse. Charlie ended her life as well, last flicker of innocence in the home, and then stillness. The Lawson farmhouse, once filled with noise, chatter of children, clanking of dishes, the rhyme of daily life, fell into a silence so heavy it seemed to hang in the air. Outside, the neighbors' homes bustling with sounds of Christmas, laughter, clinking of dishes, hymns sung around the fireplace. But here, on Brick Cove Road, the holiday turned into a scene of unspeakable tragedy. Charlie stood among the bodies of his wife and children, the gravity of what he had done pressing down on him. The walls of the house had sheltered his family for years and stood as a witness to their destruction. And then, leaving them behind, he turned and walked into the woods. Only Arthur, away in town, had been spared. Charlie walked slowly toward the wood behind the farmhouse, and the stretch of trees that the family knew well. It was where the tobacco fields gave into the forest, where the earth dipped into the shadow hollows. On Christmas Day, the woods would have been bare and brittle, branches etched against the pale winter sky. Neighbors later said that they heard dogs barking, restless and settled, as if they sensed something was wrong. Something even recalled the echo of a gunshot carried faintly through the hills, then silent, then another. It seemed that Charlie spent hours wandering in the woods, pacing among the trees. Whether he was wrestling with what he had done, praying, or simply waiting for courage, no one could ever say. But he didn't return home. Instead, he lingered there, shotgun in hand, until that afternoon faded. The 19-year-old author returned home from his errand, completely unaware of the horror that had taken place. The sight that greeted him, crowd of horrified neighbors, police officers gathered in his yard, their faces pale and tear-struck, was the first sign of tragedy beyond measure. Arthur walked toward the house he had left only hours before, expecting a warmth for his family on Christmas Day. Instead, he was met by a police officer who took charge of a sole survivor. Keeping him safe, the perpetrator, Charlie Lawson, was still at large on the property. Arthur had already lost everyone he loved: his mother, his siblings, his baby sister. The final confirmation of his nightmare came with a single blast of the shotgun echoed through the nearby woods. Officers and neighbors then ventured into the woods and found Charlie Lawson slumped against the base of a tree. In his pocket were a few small, hastily scrawled notes that offered little comfort and no real answers. One read simply, "Trouble can cause." The rest trailed off. Another was just incomplete. No one to blame but, as with his final murderous act, his parting words were too tangled to make any sense. Neighbors tried to comfort Arthur, but what solace could be there? A weight of survival guilt fell heavy on his shoulders. He was spared only because he had an errand for shotgun shells, a detail that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The Lawson home, once filled with laughter, now stood as a place of unfathomable horror. In the days that followed, it would become something else entirely. Inside, the scene was beyond comprehension. The Christmas tree stood in the corner, with paper, chain, and strings of popcorn gently swaying by the draft of the door. On the kitchen table, Marie's half-finished cake sat untouched. The stockings, once filled with candy and fruit, now seemed cruel reminders of morning innocence. Neighbors covered their mouths, some crying out loud, others falling silent, too stunned to speak. Strong men who worked the fields every day found themselves trembling, unable to steady their hands. Women pulled their youngest children away, shutting their eyes. By afternoon, the yard was filled with people, horse tied to fence posts, wagons lined the dirt road. Neighbors huddled together in disbelief. The air was thick with grief, shock, and whispers. Why would Charlie do this? What drove him to do it? On December 27th, 1929, the Lawson family was laid to rest. A single long trench was dug at Browder's family cemetery, a small burial ground tucked into the rolling hills of the Germanton. Into the trench went the bodies of Fanny, Marie, Carrie, Mabel, James, Raymond, and Mary Lou, all placed side by side. Charlie's body was buried with them, though separated slightly, as if, even in death, the community wished to keep him apart. The funeral drew hundreds. Some were family, others were neighbors, and many were strangers. People who had traveled from nearby towns pulled shocking headlines. The Lawson tragedy spread throughout North Carolina like wildfire. Newspapers carried the story. Radio buzzed with it. By the time the funeral began, the crowds was so large that the ministers had to raise their voices to be heard. Arthur stood at the graveside, barely 19. Suddenly, last of his family. He had gone from being one son of among many to being utterly alone. His face, witness said, was blank with shock, as though grief had hollowed him out. But what happened next added another layer to the story. In weeks after the burial, the Lawsons' farmhouse itself became a destination. People were curious, horrified, unable to stay away. Neighbors remembered long lines of visitors walking up Brook Cove Road, eager to step inside the house where the massacre had occurred. Charlie's brother, Marion Lawson, opened the home to the public. Admission, 25 cents, a small coin, but one that added up quickly as thousands passed through. Inside, the bloodstain had not even faded yet, and the family Christmas tree still stood, with gifts beneath it unopened. Visitors walked past in silence, some weeping, others whispering, a few treating it more like a grim entertainment than mourning. Even pieces of the family's cake, the very one Marie had been baking on the Christmas morning, were saved and displayed as a morbid keepsake. For some, incomprehensible. For others, it was a chance to gawk at tragedy. Either way, the Lawsons' home became one of the darkest tourist attractions in the Depression era of America. And for Arthur, every day brought reminders, not just of what he had lost, but of how his family suffered, had been turned into a spectacle. In the days after the massacre, people searched desperately for answers. How could a man known as a hard-working farmer, a churchgoer, and a father of 7 turn on his family in such a horrific way? Three theories arose to the surface, none fully explained, but each lingered for nearly a century. The first theory is that Charles had suffered a head injury while working on the farm. Some said that he had complained of headaches and had trouble with his temper afterwards. And neighbors recalled he wasn't the same, quick to anger, moodier, and withdrawn. Doctors speculated that the brain trauma could have changed his behavior, perhaps damaging the part of the brain that tied to impulse control. In the 1920s, such injuries weren't well understood, were left with only a rumor. Second theory is that the year 1929 was hard on everyone. The Great Depression had begun, tobacco prices had dropped, and farmers like Charlie were feeling the pain and the strain. Raising 7 children on unstable income was crushing even for some hardworking men, and even for him. Finally, in the 1990s, author Trudy J. Smith interviewed a relative and locals who claimed that Charlie had sexual abuse, abusing his eldest daughter, Marie. Now, according to the accounts, Marie had confided into a friend that she was pregnant and that the baby father was her own father. If true, this meant that Charlie's secret would have been exposed, either through Marie's pregnancy or her growing refusal to stay silent. The theory suggests that Charlie chose to kill his family to silence them forever, to prevent shame from falling on his own name. The family portrait he arranged just days before may have his twisted way of preserving the image of a happy family before destroying it. No official records confirm this theory, but it remains most disturbing and the one that many locals quietly believe. In the end, Charlie took the truth with him into the woods. His unfinished notes gave no explanation. Was it brain damage, financial despair, or the unthinkable act of abuse? We'll truly never know. What we do know is that the Lawson Massacre wasn't just a story of one man's violence. It was a story of a community left with questions that time could never fully answer. Arthur tried to keep living. He married, he had children of his own, and he worked hard, like most men in Stokes County. But those who knew him said he never truly freed of that day. Survivor guilt clung to him. He had lived only of a twist of fate. In town, he couldn't escape the whispers. People looked at him with pity, sometimes curiosity, some even speculation or suspicion. Everywhere he went, the Lawson name carried shadows. When the Lawson's farm was opened to the public, Arthur left with the knowledge that strangers were filling through the spaces where his family died, peer into his past. Some say he hated it. Others say he understood it, that people would always want to see themselves what horror looked like. Arthur lived just 16 years beyond that Christmas. In 1945, he was killed in a car accident. Irony was cruel. After surviving the unimaginable as a teenager, his life ended suddenly on the road. At his funerals, locals noted how heavy the past hung over him, as though Arthur had carried the entire story of his family on his shoulders until the day he died. Even today, nearly a century later, the Lawson's name in Germanton stirs memory, not of just one man, Charlie, but of the entire family lost, and of a boy who lived, who could never truly escape it. The Lawson family murders of 1929 were not just another tragedy in the annals of true crime, but at its core, it was never a folklore. It was 7 lives, each with names and faces and futures that would never happen. Fanny would keep her home together with quiet strength. Marie, a young woman on the edge of adulthood, with dreams that were silenced. James and Raymond, mischief boys, who should have grown up into men. Carrie and Mabel, sisters, walking through cold laughter that morning. And little Mary Lou, the baby who had never even had a chance. And then there's Arthur, the lone survivor, carrying it all until his own life was cut short. These names matter. They're why we tell these stories. Nearly 100 years later, we still look back at Christmas of '29 because it reminds us of something universal. That life can change in a heartbeat. That behind closed doors, there may be struggles we'll never see. That tragedy doesn't end with the headlines. The Lawson murders remind us how fragile family can be, of the weight of grief and the need to remember those who were lost with dignity. And so the Lawson's farmhouse may have crumbled, the cake may have turned to dust, but the stories endure, not because of Charlie, not because of the horror, but because of the victims. Though ended too soon, they mattered. And in remembering them, nearly a century later, we make sure they are not lost to silence.